Marvel has 4,700 characters. You know, we have superheroes, we have mutants, and we have humans, and we have heroes. And Punisher is a hero/victim.
In 1974, I had been writing Spider-Man for about a year and a half. I created a character called the Jackal, who was going to be my behind-the-scenes mystery figure. And in order to keep the stories interesting, I had to have subordinate villains who would come in and operate on the Jackal's behalf. One of those villains was the Punisher. The Punisher was acting under the direction of the Jackal and attacking Spider-Man. He thought that Spider-Man was a villain, and he had been misled. In the course of that story, when he discovers the truth, he immediately drops his attack on Spider-Man. When I created the character, my thought was, he's a bad guy, he's a villain, I'm just going to let that happen. But as I was writing the story, I became more sympathetic to his point of view, so I said, you know, well, maybe he doesn't follow through on this. And as a result, you know, we had this little turn in the middle of the story where, you know, he recognizes what's going on and he turns against the Jackal and shows his sense of honor. At that time, I liked to draw little sketches of the new characters that I was creating for Spider-Man. I'm not an artist, so these were kind of inept little doodlings. For the Punisher, I drew this costume of like a black jumpsuit with a small skull on his chest. And I brought this to John Romita, who was the art director at the time. He expanded the skull, brought it down, turned the teeth into bandoliers, you know, made it look cool.
I was always looking for a different angle. I was always looking to try and make characters as different as possible and as functional as possible. I came up with a sketch, and I remember the name they gave me was the Grim Reaper or maybe the Executioner. They hadn't arrived at the Punisher yet. Spider-Man was a vigilante. Captain America was a vigilante of sorts. Superman was a vigilante.
When you have a character like the Punisher, you're putting it right out there. His power is that he admits he's outside the law. Here we had a sympathetic character who was going around shooting people. For the most part, this was not behavior that was approved by the Comics Code.
Code approved was an actual stamp of approval on our artwork.
In the 1950s, everyone was very upset about crime comics and horror comics, and the publishers got together and decided, well, okay, before the Congress could step in and start censoring comics, they would go in and censor them themselves. You couldn't have heroes kill people. Heroes had to be good and brave and noble and great role models for kids, which the Punisher wasn't.
From the very beginning, he was a kind of controversial figure. As part of Marvel's expansion in the 70s, we were publishing these black and white magazine format comic book stories in which anything could go. And the Punisher was a natural for that.
They took him out of the superhero world, which he was forced to be in when he guest starred in Spider-Man, and they pretty much did straight crime stories with him.
That's when we really filled out his backstory, which gave him a motivation that explained his actions and provided a moral justification for his behavior. The Punisher was a Vietnam vet whose family was killed by the mob. They were on a picnic in Central Park. They happened to witness something that they shouldn't have seen, and they were slaughtered, and he was left for dead.
It wasn't his fault that his family was killed. He didn't do anything to provoke it. And then as he waits for the justice system to handle it, they don't. And he snaps. And he realizes that current society isn't punishing the guilty as adequately as he thinks they need to be punished. So he decides he's going to do it.
His initial motivation was to have vengeance on those who had killed his family, and then it just expanded from there. Once you kill those bad guys, what do you do next? Well, you move on to the next layer and the next layer.
It became an obsession, a kind of madness.
My idea of the Punisher was that he was a guy who was driven by his need for vengeance, but was not so driven that he couldn't see what was going on around him.
His system of ethics, his moral code, is very different from most people, but it's specific, and it exists. He doesn't kill innocent people. He has a benchmark for people that deserve to die, and he's going to kill them. But it's not an arbitrary benchmark, and it's not one that he violates.
Punisher, he has no special abilities. You punch him, he bleeds. Takes a bullet, he almost dies. He is totally vulnerable. Actually, as a man is on a mission to die, not to live, until he discovers that living is tougher and you have to be a hero to continue.
He is capable of heroism, like he's the kind of guy who would, without a second's thought, charge into a burning building to save a child. He's also, well, obsessive and insane and twisted enough to happily mow down 40 or 50 people in an afternoon.
I think later writers would bring in their own interpretation, and their interpretation was that he didn't have a total grasp of reality.
I had actually been trying to get the Punisher off the ground since, well, 76 was when I first, like I say, I first pitched it. And then in late 78, I started doing work for Marvel, and in 1979, they started doing miniseries, and I thought the Punisher would make a great miniseries.
I was working in a comic shop when the Stephen Grant, Mike Zeck miniseries first came out. It was Mike Zeck that people were familiar with from Master of Kung Fu and things of that nature.
I have to say Mike was the prime factor in getting the series off the ground, not me.
The first issue, Punisher's firing away with 2 guns, his mouth's wide open in a scream, there's probably spit flying. You couldn't help but pick the thing up. Everyone bought that issue. Everyone was freaking out about it.
They did something very special. They established him as a steady monthly character.
Came out on a Friday morning and was sold out everywhere in the country by about noon on Friday, and Marvel just went nuts.
I think when Stephen Grant took over the Punisher, he had time and he had insight and started really trying to flesh out this guy.
He was nothing but untapped potential. And I wanted to tap it, and that's why I thought he deserved his own comic. As far as I was concerned, he was no more heroic than anyone else in the book. So I don't want to make it sound like I think that he's a terribly heroic guy, because I don't, or that he's someone to emulate. But everybody likes, you know, seeing somebody kick ass once in a while, which is the appeal of action heroes. The Punisher is a guy who goes out there and does that.
When I took over the character, which would have been around 99, 2000, I was really able to start again from scratch, take it right back to basics. There's no sidekicks, there's no armor with all kinds of technology to help him out, there's no computer hacking, there's no teaming up with superheroes. The character was as grim and dark and humorless as ever, but what was going on around him was that little bit more grotesque, a little bit crazy.
He took the character and he really grounded him in the real world. This is what the Punisher would be like if he lived in the universe that we live in, as opposed to the universe that the Spider-Man character lives in.
The Punisher is by far the most grounded of all the comic book heroes, but he's still pretty larger than life. Tim Bradstreet's art really, really sold that.
The direction for the Punisher and my involvement with it was, at the beginning, just to come up with images that would sell the book and be interesting to look at. Centered on Frank Castle, the character. Iconic shots, every issue to look like a #1 issue.
Bradstreet's work is like looking at a photograph, whereas the other covers that you would compare it to from the other artists are, you know, more of looking at a cartoon. And it's arresting in the sense that it's much more theatrical, it's much more filmic.
They were a big selling point, and the ones he's doing at the moment are particularly nice. He's introduced a lot more story to the covers.
Straightforward, in your face, frank, skulls, guns.
I think of the Punisher as a Rorschach test for writers and readers. In each of the incarnations that he's had over the several years, since his creation, he's reflected the times that he was being written and drawn in. In the mid-70s, we were in a period of kind of cynicism towards government, so the idea of this figure operating outside of government was appealing.
Everything's cyclical, and we're kind of, hitting that point again. People are a little disillusioned and tired of the way things are working, and here's this guy who operates outside of it, and he's kind of our voice.
Punisher will always be center stage for the human hero of Marvel. It's something that we all relate to. Most people don't have the guts to stand for what they believe in because it's dangerous.
I think the most interesting thing to me about the Punisher and his popularity is that it came from the character. The readership discovered him as much as we did. That's when a character takes on a life of his own and becomes something beyond what his creators imagined him to be.